Gloria in excelsis Deo.
Hello, my name is Father John Perricone. I am very happy to be with you again today in this series of meditations. I teach at St. Francis College. I am a professor of philosophy there. And again, I'm so happy you've taken time to be with us. Today I would like to talk about that first article of the Apostles' Creed, I believe in God. I would like to approach it not from the way in which you usually are accustomed to understanding it. Most Catholics believe in God by virtue of their Catholic faith, and they have absolute and firm certitude of God's existence because Mother Church has told us. And that is a noble motive to believe in God, and it gives grace that we believe all that Mother Church has offered us to believe for the salvation of our souls. However, it is important for us to recognize as Catholics that aside from accepting on the Church's authority certain truths, like the existence of God, certain of them, not very many, can be arrived at with that same certitude by reason, that is, by intellect alone. And that is what we would like to be the subject of our few chats in these next few sessions. Is it possible for man, unaided by the revelation of the Catholic Church, to come to a certain understanding that God exists? Now, before we say anything further about that question, let me give you a little bit of a theological, a philosophical context, an historical context. At the First Vatican Council, that one that took place in the middle of the 19th century, called by Blessed Pius IX, one of its subjects was precisely the one we're talking about today, the existence of God. And the question was this: does man, in his natural reason, without the assistance of the revelation of the Church, is man capable of arriving at a certain knowledge of God's existence? Now, there were some who would say no, that it is only by accepting the revelation of Almighty God from the Church that we could arrive at a certain and clear understanding of God's existence. The Church condemned that position. She called it fideism. Fideism is that position which would insist that the only way to arrive at a certainty of God's existence is through the act of faith. The Church declared that it is possible to arrive at a certainty of God's existence by using reason and reason alone. You see, God created us in His image and likeness. Part of that image and likeness is to possess an intellect whose purpose, whose very nature, is to be able to know and to grasp the truth. Moreover, He has given us a will. It's right within the nature of what makes us to be men and women, makes us to be like God. What is the purpose of the will? The purpose of the will is to embrace, to love the good. So if the nature of the intellect is to know the truth, it must be possible for us, in looking about us, to somehow arrive at a knowledge of the truth of God's existence. That is exactly what the First Vatican Council declared. Actually, she was mirroring what St. Thomas Aquinas had said in the very first articles of his masterpiece, the Summa Theologiae, that it is indeed possible for man, by virtue of his natural reason, to come to an understanding of some of the truths, even though we cannot access them directly, the way I can access a knowledge of a rabbit directly by opening my eyes, or the way I can access the sound of a child's voice by my ear, or the way I can have access to the taste of delicious food by virtue of the flavor it has. We can gain access to the existence of God. Actually, St. Thomas Aquinas has a section of the Summa, in the very first articles, that he said these constitute what he calls the preambula fidei. The preambula fidei. Roughly translated, the preface to faith. The things that we can know before even faith takes over in its action to guide us. There are 3 articles, 3 things that man can know without having to use the gift, the virtue of faith. 1, the certainty of God's existence. 2, the certainty of the existence of man's soul and its immortality. And thirdly, the existence of good and evil. Regarding those 3 truths, man can have not only a knowledge, but a certainty. And he can know those 3 truths before even invoking or depending upon the virtue of faith. Maybe another time we'll talk about those bottom 2 truths, the certainty of the existence of man's immortal soul and the certainty of the existence of good and evil. It might be well for us to talk about those someday, because in our contemporary culture, both those realities are being held in doubt. They are either, or we are either being told that those are simply, they remain in the realm of one's personal opinion, one's own personal knowledge, and has nothing to do with the domain of public truth. Believe it if you'd like, don't ask anyone else to believe in it. Or, more dramatically, some in our society and our culture will simply say that your intellect, O man, is incapable of attaining any truth whatsoever. We want to avoid those 2 things, and sadly, those 2 elements, the existence of the soul and its immortality, and the existence of good and evil, it requires that we do some heavy philosophical lifting to establish that to a cultural audience that wants to have nothing to do with faith, and we can, just as we will do for the existence of God. In talking about the existence of God, St. Thomas Aquinas sets down 5 paths that the intellect can take in order to clearly demonstrate that God exists. They are commonly known as the Quinque Viae, the 5 ways. But before that, let me just talk about the method St. Thomas uses. It's important. St. Thomas wants us to recognize that the way we proceed to demonstrate God's existence is really simple. It's available to anyone. And that's the genius of this position. That is why the Church calls Thomas her common doctor. He knows all that is necessary for you to demonstrate God's existence is to look around the world. To look around at anything which exists. Anything available to your senses. A stone, a blade of grass, a racing electron, a rabbit. Any of these things will do. From these, as we will see, he is going to proceed step by step to analyzing what is it that we see, and he brings us to a certainty of God's existence. He recognizes this is very important. One of his philosophical predecessors, Saint Anselm, had a completely different approach. He also attempted to prove God's existence in a very famous philosophical work called the Proslogion. In that work, Saint Anselm insisted that in order to demonstrate God's existence, no need to look at the world around you, that blade of grass, or that stone, or the baby's voice. All that is necessary, according to St. Anselm, who wrote this in the 11th century AD, was to look inside your mind. Think about your idea of God. Think about what that idea means. When you do, you might come up with something like this. God is that about which nothing greater can be conceived. Seems to be okay to me. Seems to be quite persuasive. Then Anselm goes on to say, well, my goodness, if God is the most perfect, and in order to have the perfection of all perfections, you have to exist, St. Anselm concluded that God therefore must exist. If he's the greater than which nothing greater can be conceived, if he doesn't exist, then I could conceive of something which does exist that would be greater than him. We're doing St. Anselm a little bit of injustice by not really protracting the way he goes about proving God's existence, but that's essentially it. St. Thomas found some problems with that. Certainly no problem with St. Anselm's faith, God forbid, but some problems with the way St. Anselm reasoned. Essentially, St. Thomas said, well, when you have an idea of God, and you simply say, the idea of existence seems to be compatible with the idea of God, where have you gone? St. Thomas would say, nowhere. You've stayed in your intellect, haven't you? You haven't demonstrated to me anything in reality. You're weaving things all up there in your mind. And that might seem perfectly consistent to you. St. Anselm's proof to this very day is quite consistent and persuasive to a whole lot of folks. But it's wrong. It proves nothing except the consistency of ideas. We want more than that, don't we? We want to persuade the person we are talking to that God's existence is as real, and in fact, more real than that blade of grass, than the child's voice, than you who are sitting and listening to me right now. St. Anselm's approach comes to be known as an a priori approach, as opposed to St. Thomas Aquinas, who's an a posteriori. Very simply, St. Anselm is beginning to want to prove God's existence before the consultation with the ordinary experience of all men. St. Thomas says that's not going to do. The way we begin to prove God's existence is posterior, after we have consulted the experience of men. This is where St. Thomas wants to begin. And that's where we're going to begin. His 5 proofs. They're magnificent. They've brought so many, including many of my students, to a sober recognition that indeed God exists. And take note, from there, the honest mind will go on to say, if God exists, then very likely he can speak to me. He can speak to the church. Given a little bit more thought, that kind of mind becomes open to God becoming flesh. Those are other questions, but at least what Thomas is doing is tilling the soil. When he talks about the 5 ways to prove God's existence, he is asking us, look at the world, take anything, take that blade of grass. What he's asking us in each one of those proofs is to take note of something very obviously clear to the way I perceive that thing, and we take off from there. Give you a brief overview. In the first proof, he's going to ask us, look at the world and recognize that things move, that they're able to change. I've whet your appetite. I thank you for listening. Next time, we're going to go into the depth of those 5 proofs and see how well they demonstrate God's existence. Thank you.
Gloria